Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at a couple of N-gauge locos, starting with this Dapol Hall class loco. As you can see, it's covered in dust and grime, is missing its drive shaft from tender to loco, and the connecting wires between the loco and the tender have all snapped off and broken. This Hall has come from the same diorama setup that the N-gauge Battle of Britain came from that we did a few episodes ago. So I'm going to put this Hall on some N-gauge track just to give it a battery test, although I know it won't move under its own power, as like I've said, the drive shaft appears to be missing. So I've got a battery lead connector now just to make life easier on N-gauge track, and applying power to the track, the motor in the tender was turning over, although like I said there was no movement as the drive shaft was missing. It was very erratic running as well, so we're going to have to try and strip this tiny little loco down and see what we can do. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get this old paintbrush and I'm going to give this one hell of a good dusting over, as this was covered in dust bunnies, hairs and God knows what else from being sat on that chap's diorama layout for many years. Both the front and rear coupling are also missing on this model. But this model doesn't belong to me. This model I am doing on behalf of Trains for You, so they can replace the couplings when I return it to them. I'm going to start by stripping the loco from its tender by removing these very tiny screws, and I had to dig around my toolbox to find a screwdriver small enough for these tiny Phillips screws, and I end up using one of the tiny Phillips screwdrivers I got in one of my Aldi and Lidl tool videos. So I'm going to start now by looking at the loco part of this model, and I'm going to remove the screw here to remove the front pony wheels, as I really need to get in and strip the body shell off just to re-lubricate the drivetrain that's in the driving wheels. Without using the magnetic tray, I'm going to keep each screw with its component so I know which screw went where. There's more dust and fluff underneath there, and then removing this other tiny screw removes the bracket for the front pony turret. And that's it for screws on this model. I was looking around for ages looking for a screw to undo to release the body shell, but we'll see as I've now turned my attention to the tender, we'll see that this is mainly a push fit, clip fit together model. So I remove another tiny screw which releases the tender drawbar. I'll put that on the pad there, and I'm also going to remove these two tiny screws that have brass washers on them that connect power from the loco wheels to the tender motor. This will all have to be resoldered and rewired later on, and will prove to be one of the tiniest soldering jobs I've ever undertaken. So just gently pulling the body shell there, it unclips from the tender chassis and we find the motor and DCC interface. Although rather worryingly there's a lot of rust damage on the coils on this motor, although it does turn relatively freely. So again, giving this a good dusting over with the paintbrush to remove all that built up dust and crud. I'm just giving it the once over to see if there's any visible damage, and then I'm going to apply battery power directly to the rear wheels to see if this motor spins it or not. I'm trying to remove some of the rust build-up on the coils, but it's not coming off very easy. So standing the battery up and placing it on, you can see there that the motor spins instantly, and there doesn't appear to be any damage. The rust is just superficial surface damage, which is very lucky. This model really is an exquisite piece of engineering. There is a slight bit of water damage inside the tender there, so I assume that at some point this model has been stored outside in the damp. There's no way for me to get to the commutator and the brushes on this, so I'm just going to add a tiny amount of oil to the front bearing there, and then checking over all the wheels etc. I'm going to refit the tender body now after just giving that a spin to spread that oil through the bearing, and that's the tender pretty much complete. Like I said, it's just a clip fit. There's a hole in the tender front there for the drive shaft to slip through. The clip goes in the back, just gentle pressure, and then the front clips on. A very nifty design, although I would imagine those plastic clips are easily broken if you're not careful. Now I contacted DCC suppliers and I purchased a new drive shaft for this, so I'm just going to clean the tender wheels now a cotton bud soaked in methylated spirits. And then once that's done, I mean the crud on these wheels ended up being a lot more encrusted than I thought, so I had to break out the fiberglass pencil. And like I said, once that's done, I'm going to now turn my attention to the Loco, which also clip fits. And there's a die-cast boiler with a weight in it. There really is some weight to this tiny little model. And you can see there the gearbox and drivetrain that gives this model its haulage capacity. The rear driving wheels on this model also have traction tyres fitted to them, so I reckon this would pull a house if you let it. So again, with the paintbrush, just working in there to get all the dust and fluff out that has landed and accumulated on this model. It just goes to show how dirty they can get even when they're static. The model is also very dry, so I'm going to re-lubricate the drivetrain with some silicone grease, followed up by a small amount of oil. And then once the model is reconnected and the drive shaft's reconnected, I will give it a spin just to spread that through the drivetrain. You really don't need a lot of lubrication on these N-gauge models. A tiny drop is enough to spread through the entire model. Over lubrication at this stage will just result in more work and you'll have to clean it all off. So I'm just trying to turn the drive shaft pinion there with this screwdriver, but the gear reduction is such that the wheels are hardly turning, so I'm going to give that up as a bad job and I'm going to let the motor spin it for me. To refit the body shell onto the chassis, you just have to mind the detail parts there, and it's a simple clip fit back into the frames. And then I replace the screws we took out earlier and replace the front pony truck and all the screws, like I said, that we took out. Now that that's all done, you can see there I've also removed the screws for the pickups. I'm going to give it another dusting, as there's dust everywhere on this model. You think you've got it all and it just appears out of nowhere. I'm also going to lubricate those front pony wheels with a tiny amount of oil as well, as they were running dry and had quite a lot of fluff inside them. So reattaching the front pony wheel there. Once that's all done, again using these tiny Phillips screwdrivers, it's time to reattach the locomotive to the tender. That's when I can get that screw tight enough, that is. And there, like I say, just a tiny amount of oil on those front axles, as the metal axles run in the plastic housing, and if you're not careful it can wear away the plastic. I also noticed that a couple of handrail knobs on the handrails there have come loose, so I reinsert them with the aid of the Tweezernose pliers. Now I'm going to fit the drive shaft that we got as a spare part. It simply clip fits into the firebox. Line it up with the one on the tender. It clip fits in there. Don't add too much pressure, as you don't want to snap that drive shaft. And then gently holding the model upside down, I use the tiny screwdriver to replace the screw and connect the loco and tender back together with the tender drawbar. Once this is all back together, I'm going to look at replacing and repairing those wires that link the loco to the tender. Just make sure that's flexible enough, and putting a battery onto the rear wheels there, you can see now that the loco wheels are driving quite nicely. I'm just going to do that forwards and backwards just to make sure that lubrication spreads through that drivetrain. Initially it was a little stiff, but it did loosen up with the more we tested it. So these are the wires I'm going to have to solder, these tiny little brass, they're like O-rings, and it took me some time, but I managed to accomplish soldering them. While the model was upside down, I also took the opportunity just to shine up the front wheels there that pick up power. Like I said, the rear driving wheels have got traction tyres on, but I still gave them a rub over with the fiberglass pencil to remove any encrusted dirt that was on them. I don't think this model's got many miles on its clock, but it was surprising how oxidised and dirty the wheels had become. Now I've got my helping hands out, and even these were struggling to hold these tiny brass rivets. And you can see now, with the aid of a magnifier, this tiny soldering job. I haven't got a very fine soldering point, and this proved to be quite difficult, but I got there in the end with some perseverance and patience. Once one end was soldered, it was left to cool completely, and then with the tweezer nose pliers I put the screw in the brass rivet, or the brass washer sorry, and then screwed it into place. Once all 4 screws were in place, I made sure that the tender and the loco could pivot easily without breaking any of the soldering joints, and you can see there just how tiny those wires were compared to my thumbnail. And now I'm going to test the loco with the different pickups of all the wheels. So we can see there that it works on the tender wheels, and then I put one on the front driving wheel and it's working as well, which proves that we've actually fixed that pickup issue. So there we have the rebuilt Hall all back to ready for service bar its couplings, and we can see it here running up and down a short length of N-gauge track on my dining room table. As I've mentioned before, I don't actually have an N-gauge layout. Any N-gauge repairs I do have all been sent in to me. So now the Hall's done, we're going to turn our attention to a GraFar or GraFar Prairie Tank. This again came from the same guy's diorama, and this again is a non-running loco, although it doesn't appear to be as dusty as the Hall was. So placing this on a piece of N-gauge track, I'll give it a battery test, and it started to run but then nothing. It's quite dirty and it might even be seized up, as the motor was buzzing but it wasn't managing to turn the wheels around at all. So gentle persuasion got it going there on the track, but there's nothing else. So we're going to have to strip it down and have a look at what's going on inside. So first off, again, I'm going to get this old stiff paintbrush and dust off all this horrible crud and that's all on the outside of it and underneath on the chassis, as I don't want to be stripping it down and inviting any of this dust into the motor and creating myself more work. Considering these have been sat on a diorama, they're in quite good condition, there's no fading to them, although all the couplings are missing on most of them, which is a great shame. So to strip this down, you have to remove these 2 screws that also hold the pony trucks in place at the rear and the front of the model. And then, very much like the Battle of Britain we saw, the model just simply falls down from the front and then is disengaged from 2 slots in the die-cast body shell. And here we have the usual pull motor setup, and it is identical to the Battle of Britain we did. So I'm not going to have any problems in servicing this model. Dusting off all the dust that's inside the body shell here, I removed the screws that release the motor from the chassis, and there's 2. There's one at the front that also holds in that pickup wire with a small bolt, and there's one at the rear, and then the wheel sets fall away and the motor's been released. To remove the brushes, you have to remove these tiny brass holders, and it's worth working carefully doing this, holding the brass with your forefinger, as you don't want it to shoot off and lose the brush spring, as it's hard enough to find them when you work with 00, and these N-gauge springs are really tiny. So tapping the motor there, you can see the brush falls out, and I'll remove the bottom brush as well, and then we clean up the commutator faceplate, firstly by polishing it with a fiberglass pencil, and then I polish it up with a cotton bud and methylated spirits, and then using a shaved down toothpick I actually go through the gaps in the commutator to remove any carbon buildup, as buildup of carbon in between the commutator plates can cause short circuits and poor running when running this model on a layout. The end of a cocktail stick was too large for this job, so I did actually have to shave it down with a scalpel into like a wedge shape, but you've seen me do that hundreds of times before by now, I'm sure. Once that was all done, I gave it another quick polish up with a cotton bud, and also then cleaned the ends of these tiny brushes just to remove any carbon deposits and built up rubbish from when the model was last run. And now I start to reassemble the motor, and I'm going to give it a test. First on the reassembly is to put the brush in the top and just make sure that it goes down, followed by the spring, and then these brass keeper plates that were also given a polish up using the fiberglass pencil. Once the top and bottom brushes holders are both in, I give the model a quick bit of juice from these wires, and you can see it spinning quite nicely. So at least we know the motor's working. Next thing on the agenda is to clean all the pickups. So removing the base plate from the wheel treads, just give the pickups a quick wipe with a cotton bud and methylated spirits, just so that I can ensure that everything is clean to ensure good electrical conductivity. The wheels were given a clean and a polish up with the cotton bud and methylated spirits, and I noticed that the front and rear wheels aren't actually held on. The crank pins are simply just small plastic lugs that fit through the side rods, and this made cleaning the wheel sets very easy indeed. Although it is the tolerances on these N-gauge models are such that the side rods don't just fly off, which is a very nice design feature. Once the wheels and pickups have been cleaned up, it was time to reassemble the chassis and the motor, first by putting the motor in place, followed by the wheels, and then the chassis keeper plate was put in place and secured, firstly with the long bolt through the front, which is secured with a nut which also secures the pickup wire, and then the rear screw, and then just giving it a quick test there just to make sure that the pickups are all working correctly. Once that's done, the cylinder block was added and the piston rods were threaded through. The rear pony truck was added as well, and then the motor was slotted back into the die-cast slots on the body shell and then pushed gently in forward, making sure that the cylinders are in the die-cast hole for them in the front. The front pony truck is held on with the body securing screw, so this was then placed through the chassis keeper plate and the chassis, and the final screw was then reinserted and tightened up, and then I'm going to give the Prairie a quick test on that N-gauge track just to see if we've managed to make this into a runner again. Before we do the test, I'm going to have to invert it again, and using a power lead again, I'm just going to give the wheels a good clean up like we did with the Hall previous. Quick polish up with a fiberglass pencil on all of the 6 driving wheels, followed by a polish up with the cotton bud and methylated spirits, and you can see there just how shiny those driving wheels have come up. So I'm really hoping now, by the way this is running with a power lead, it'll be a nice strong runner when we put it on the test track. So it's now back on the track. I put the battery power, and there you go. The Prairie Tank has also been restored from its non-running condition into a nice little running model. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, or is it just in need of repair, please contact me on the email address you can see on screen, Dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, and it may even feature in a Trash to Track episode all of its own. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.